Hello, welcome to another screencast, and this time I'll be discussing the water molecule and polarity. So some learning targets that we're trying to get taken care of here today. So basically looking at properties of water that result from its polarity, and then also talking about hydrogen bonding, and then a little bit about linking how that hooks up to biological function. So really sort of be dealing with these level 1 targets here. So talking first about covalent bonds within the water molecule, then polarity, and then a little bit about the hydrogen bonding between the water molecules. So the reason we do this is sort of taking this reductionist view of life there. And if we're looking all the way down from the organism level down to this atomic or this atomic and molecular level, dealing with the molecules and elements in basic biochemistry. And one of those molecules that's critically important is, of course, the water molecule. So you may remember from some introductory chemistry here that, of course, water is two hydrogens and an oxygen that are covalently bonded together. So these arrows here represent covalent bonds, which is a shared pair of electrons. So this is E negative is electron here, so shared pair of electrons. But because this oxygen atom here has a relatively high electronegativity to it, the electrons tend to spend more time around the nucleus of this oxygen atom than they do either one of these hydrogen atoms here. So consequently, these covalent bonds here are referred to as polar covalent bonds. And this polar covalent bonding here simply means that the distribution of the electrons is uneven, right? So uneven, polar, unequal. So any molecules that are described as being polar, there's something uneven about them. You can also think of polar as having, sidedness to them. Right? So these molecules, like water molecule, are polar. They have sidedness to them, and the sides are because of the distribution, the unequal distribution, sharing of these electrons in these polar covalent bonds. So consequently, this water molecule has a partial negative charge. So this here is read as partial, and I think that's it's a lowercase sigma. But this is a partial negative charge, and then a partial positive charges down here. Right? Oh no, I have it down here. It's a lowercase delta, and so this partial charge is, you contrast that with something that is totally ionic or that is fully charged. Right? Say something like a sodium ion or a proton, right? Where there wouldn't be necessarily a covalent bond formed there. So all water molecules are polar because of this, primarily because of this oxygen atom right here being electronegative and tending to have the electrons spend more time around the oxygen. Consequently, they have this side of the molecule is partially negative, and then this side of the water molecule is partially positive, right? So because of that, when you have water molecules in solution or when you just have water molecules in general, there will be a type of interaction here that is called a hydrogen bond. And these hydrogen bonds are forming always between partially negative and partially positive parts of these polar molecules. Remember that this is going to be the oxygen, and here's the oxygen of this atom, of this molecule down here. And so the water molecules orient themselves such that you get this hydrogen bond. So this is not, so you can contrast this with a covalent bond. So it's not a covalent bond because the electrons aren't being shared. You just have this little bit of an attraction, right? It's an attraction, and it's relatively weak. So each individual hydrogen bond there is relatively weak. But overall, you have lots of hydrogen bonds here, And if you sum up all the hydrogen bonds, you can get a relatively decent attraction force. Anyhow, these hydrogen bonds between the water molecules is sometimes referred to as cohesion. Right? So the water molecules cohere together. But then you can also have these polar water molecules, forming a hydrogen bond. That's terrible, hydrogen bond. So sometimes they just use these three little dots as a hydrogen bond. In this case, if this is going to be the partial positive, then you're going to have something that would be fully negatively charged or something that was partially negatively charged over here, right? So if you had some molecule X that was negatively charged or partially positively charged, that is polar or fully charged, you'd get a little hydrogen bond forming there between that, and then that would be adhesion. Adhesion, where the water molecules are forming hydrogen bonds with something else, some other molecule, some other substance that itself is either charged or polar. Right? So cohesion and adhesion. One of the most striking examples of this is, of course, in tree. Maybe not, of course. This may not be obvious to you, but I was fortunate enough to work out in Sequoia National Park. These are redwoods, not sequoia trees, but they're pretty dang tall trees. So the leaves are way up high here off the ground. Sometimes you're talking like 300 feet above the ground, but all the water is down here in the soil. So the question is, how do the water molecules get from the soil all the way up to the leaves where photosynthesis is happening and being used? And it's because of these cohesion and adhesion properties of water. Because in this little animation you see up here, right, each of these blue dots is supposed to be a water molecule that's evaporating off the leaf. But because each of the water molecules is cohered together, as you get this evaporation, you get a pull of one water molecule pulling on the next, pulling on the next, pulling on the next. And so you get this upward flow of the water molecules because the water molecules are cohered together. The water molecules also will adhere to the sides of the cells that are taking them up. So this is a xylem cell right here, and so the cell wall of this xylem cell is primarily cellulose and lignin. And this cellulose, if the water molecule is adhering to it, that tells you that cellulose is going to be a polar molecule in and of itself, right? Or parts of it are going to be charged. But cellulose is a polar molecule, so you get adhesion between those water molecules, and that helps support that column of water when it's sort of 300 feet above the ground and getting it up against that force of gravity as well. Another key component here about water molecules that we'll be dealing with a lot is getting molecules to dissolve in water versus not dissolving in water. So things that are on this side, so molecules that are going to be polar or fully charged, will interact with water molecules and are sometimes described as hydrophilic because they will interact with the water molecules. And then molecules like lipids over here are uncharged or described as nonpolar, and we'll go into that later on. But uncharged or nonpolar molecules are sometimes described as hydrophobic, meaning that they will not interact with water. And so one of the most obvious cases, again, maybe not obvious, but an example of this would be things like fats and oils. So that are triglycerides. So these parts of those molecules here are extremely nonpolar, and will therefore exclude water molecules. And we also, they just don't interact with them. There's no hydrogen bonding, so no hydrogen bonding would take place there. And one of the best examples of this, again, is going to be found in cell membranes. And so this is a plasma membrane. plasma membrane, cell membrane, phospholipid bilayer, where these parts of those phospholipids, this is one individual phospholipid right here, and then this is a larger view of that phospholipid, right? And so this part of the phospholipid molecule here that's interacting with the water molecules, this part would be polar, or it's actually negatively and positively charged, and then this part right down here would be nonpolar. And so this is a way that membranes separate solutions. So nonpolar molecules, examples here, will not interact with water, but then the polar and charged hydrophilic molecules will interact with water, and water will be able to, we say, dissolve them. So if something is dissolved, that means that the water molecules can and do form hydrogen bonds with it. They will essentially adhere to it and be then in solution, right? So that we can get them to go into solution. And how easily and how readily those water molecules interact with it depends on the individual polarity of that molecule, and so you get different kinds of solubilities there. So and there'll be a question here, so just another little application about like water striders, but I think I'm going to wrap that up at the moment. But if you want to take a second and maybe answer this question down here, predict what would happen if these coatings on these water striders' legs were actually hydrophilic instead of being hydrophobic. What would you expect to kind of happen to that water strider there? So, okay. So I hope that helps you identify and describe a little here about covalent bonds within the water molecules. And you figured out a little bit here about what we mean by polar versus nonpolar, and then sort of hydrogen bonding between those water molecules, and what we mean by here cohesion adhesion. Okay, thanks a lot for listening, and if you have any questions, bring them to class.